Hello, welcome to another episode of the Next Year Power podcast series, which addresses critical issues in the African power space. There is now the universal understanding of the need for countries to develop renewable and clean energy projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other forms of environmental pollution. However, there are a lot of processes and factors associated with developing and deploying clean energy solutions. One of these factors, and perhaps the most important, is finance. For African countries trying to close the energy deficit gap while also meeting their carbon emissions reduction goals, access to funding to these energy solutions is quite pertinent. Today, my guest is Ifeyinwa Emelife, Chief Partnership Officer for the African Development Bank in Abidjan. Welcome, Ifeyinwa. It's nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So, as the Chief Partnership Officer at the African Development Bank, can you tell us more about your role and what it involves?
Sure, and thank you for having me on this podcast. As a Chief Partnership Officer with the African Development Bank in Abidjan, I'm actually under the Power Energy Complex. And what we do, or particularly what I do, is that I raise money for things that matter in the energy sector. So things that matter from distribution, transmission, generation projects across the value chain, up until technical assistance, capacity building, initiatives, any program we run at all under the energy complex is what I do. Now, the African Development Bank, as you may well know, or for those of us that may not know, has what they call the high fives: Light Up and Power Africa, Feed Africa, Integrate Africa, improve the standard of living of Africans, and also industrialize Africa. But the important thing about this is that the first one, Light Up and Power Africa, is what is needed across for everything else to work. Now, what does that mean? You need power for agriculture, you need power to industrialize, you need power to improve the health sector, education sector. But the thing that behoves Africa right now is that the power we need has moved from fossil fuels, which we have been planning and trying to invest on now, to cleaner forms of energy. And if you've been following the news and listening to all that is happening across, clean energy is the way to go. So as a Chief Partnership Officer, I work with a number of partners from development finance institutions, the likes of the World Banks, the Islamic Development Banks, Asian Banks, to bilaterals. I work with countries, and I work with foundations, I work with private sector, I work across people that have a stake or an interest in Africa's growth and development. I work with them in accessing finance and getting funds for our activities. So in a nutshell, I get money for things that matter.
So, what role does access to finance play in the development of clean energy projects in Africa?
So remember that I said that all along Africa has been investing in fossil fuels, but now we're looking at clean forms of energy. And what are they? Wind, solar, hydro. Africa has an abundance of those. We don't have a problem with that. But what do we have a problem with? We have a problem of getting those things out of the ground or moving them to become molecules that actually serve us to do the activities that we need to live as a functional, developed country. So the role of finance in this case is that, and I'll put them in buckets for you. First of all, you need money to get studies. You might have heard in several places where they say it's not the lack of money, but it's the lack of projects. What that means is that we just do not have the right bankable studies, or we do not have the projects well prepared for them to turn into these ideas and concepts on paper to actual projects. So we need funding for that part of it to work. Feasibility studies, data gathering, policy formation, a lot of those you need money for. And then you also do need money for the actual investments. And these days you've now all been hearing about partnering with the private sector because the public sector is inundated with the problems of general growth in countries, with issues around epidemic, issues around crisis of inflation and other things. So you now have to partner. And partnering with private sector is bringing in finance. And anytime you're bringing in someone to partner with you, you also have to bring something to the table. So that is now the role of finance in this: is what are we bringing to the table apart from now the studies, we're now talking about the investments. So in that case, of course, we also now need things around guarantees that you might have heard about, de-risking projects. You also do need actual loans, equity, depending on the type of project. So the role of finance is very instrumental and key, and I think that is the bane of our problem in Africa, because we just do not have enough funds. That's what access to finance helps you do. It helps you prepare, it helps you invest, it helps you monitor.
So what are the current AFDB funding frameworks for off-grid developers?
Off-grid development is something that has been around, but I think it hasn't taken up as fast as it should in Africa. And this is because the framework is not as developed as it should be. And when I say in Africa, I exclude a few countries like maybe South Africa, who is a little bit ahead of the curve. But the AFDB has decided that the best way to help is through some of its facilities and funds that it has for off. So there's a facility in the bank called SEFA, Sustainable Energy for Africa. It's a special fund that we use to, first of all, offer assistance to countries and also do investments. So for instance, in that facility, there is what they call the Green Mini Grids program. And what it does is that it helps with countries that want to really do off-grid deployment and procurement in rural areas or in peri-urban areas. We help from the beginning to the end, the whole value chain, starting off with going out to site identification, gathering data, working with the developers, finding out what the community really needs. So that fund is really one of the very strong instruments we have in the bank that is helping off-grid development. And of course, there are others. There's one they also call FAY, Fund for Energy Inclusion, and it also looks at off-grid development. And why the bank is doing this, it has found out that you need everything possible to get Africa going. It's not just on-grid. On-grid is extremely important, but you also do need off-grid. And off-grid is when you'll hear, 600 million people do not have access to power. Most of them are in the rural areas. And so these people are, through this programs, especially through off-grid programs and off-grid development, connected. So the bank through CEFA, the bank through FAY, the bank through various other initiatives that it's working on, like Desert to Power, are looking at really improving these things.
So what roles do policy and regulations play, if any, when it comes to providing finance for renewable energy projects on the continent?
So policies are very important. You cannot invest in a country without the right policies. You cannot bring in private sector without the right policies, because they will not function in a vacuum. The government rolls out the policies, makes them transparent and enabling for people to be able to participate in the sector. So policies are very important, and especially in the off-grid space now, as we're transitioning to just clean energy. And why this is so is because if you look at the trend over the years, countries, and I'll use Nigeria for instance, where we actually do put in the right policies in place. If you've heard of the 30-30-30, where they want to do 30% of the resource planning for Nigeria, making sure that 30% of it is renewable energy by 2030 and to have about 30 gigawatts. It's an ambitious plan, but at least there is a policy around it. There is a plan that if you're engaging anybody, you work with that plan and say, this is the plan and the policy of the government. This is what they need to do. And then the regulation is absolutely critical, because from the regulation, you're able to control and monitor how you work in this area. So if the private sector is going to come in and wants to put in a mini grid in a community, it needs to understand that these are the guiding regulations, these are the tariffs that you can charge in that area. So it helps. It becomes a win-win situation for them when they have the policies and the regulations in place. And if you look at what other countries have been doing, again, I'll go back to South Africa, where I think they've done tremendously well in the off-grid space in trying to also bring in auction areas for off-grid development. They've done it so well, but how were they able to achieve that? It was through policies, and it was through the framework that they developed, and it was through the regulations. So these are some of the areas that we look at, and we try to do lessons learned. And Nigeria, I think it's coming up. So are other countries like Kenya. You also do have Zambia, who has the Get Fit program. You have quite a number. So the awareness is there. It's coming up. Government is aware that the policies need to be in place. The regulations need to be strengthened further. They also need to be improved, but it is there. They know that it has to be all part of the resource planning for the country, and something that get the buy-in of everyone so that energy and investments can flow.
What current programs is the AFDB working on to provide funding for clean energy projects in Africa?
We have quite a number. So there is a program called Desert to Power, and what that is that along the Sahel, you have about 11 countries who have very high irradiation of sunlight all through the year. These countries have the potential to just use solar. So what the bank has done is to work with the presidents and ministers of energy of these countries to create a program around setting up these solar parks in the countries whereby private sector can invest and then help them grow their capacity. But of course, before you do that, some of these countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Niger, are quote-unquote a bit fragile countries, not only in terms of macroeconomics, but also politically. So you have these programs that the bank is working with the highest level of government to ensure that it helps with bringing in clean energy by, first of all, making sure that the policies through technical assistance, that the policies and the regulatory frameworks are in place, that the enabling environment is right, that the private sector engagement has been done adequately, and that is one of the very strong channels. It's actually a very strong presidential initiative that it's very popular out there, and it's called Desert to Power. There are so many others that we have, like I have mentioned the Green Mini Grid Initiative, which is really just deploying mini grids to rural areas, working with rural electrification agencies of different countries. And also there's one we talk about called the Green Base Load, and the Green Base Load is really converting coal plants, gas plants. How do we make them green? And that is infusing more of hydro projects, or looking at things around battery storage, which is sort of the newer areas of clean energy that people are looking at, or even just thinking modernization of hydro power plants. So the bank is really strong in this area, and it's really spreading its tentacles and working with countries and with partners on doing this, because if you look at the statistics and the data, we are the receiving end. We do not pollute. I don't even think it's up to 3%, yet we are the receiving end of it. So issues around drought and famine, it gets to us, or issues around flooding, and we are the receiving end. So all the funding out there that is being discussed at COP26, and now we have COP27 coming up, Africa is at the center of it all, and we have to take advantage of it, and the African Development Bank through its programs is doing just that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people are learning about these. So what policies have you seen from other countries, perhaps European, that you think can be employed in Africa to improve access to finance for solutions providers or developers?
So that's a very good question. One thing I want us to remember is that what works in A doesn't necessarily work in B. So sometimes we find out that, we want to go and borrow all this lovely programs going out there, but our foundation is just not yet ready for it. However, that said, there is a current program that we're working with, or we're looking at in the bank, that has been extremely successful in the United States, which was where it started, and has now been moved into Latin America and Asia. So it's working in Bangladesh, Philippines, India, and it has actually been brought to Africa. Uganda is a case study of it right now, that it came in about 2008, Liberia, and it's called the Electricity Cooperatives. And what is that? It is really giving access to people in the rural areas through cooperatives. So what is a cooperative? A cooperative is you and I coming in with the same interest and saying, look, we need to provide this service for us. So you go to these communities and they say, we don't have light, we need light. Let's come together, form this cooperative, and help ourselves improve our service. So what happens is that the governments usually give them a seed capital, and that seed capital is to get the asset, the generating asset in place, be it a mini grid, be it solar panels, you get it, but it's under the management of the community. And you find out that when you entrust the community with something and say, you see this generating plant, it's for you. It breaks down, you handle it. It needs fixing, you handle it. You go around, you know the members of your community, you collect the revenue from them per tariff in terms of buying credit. And you do that. And we found out that when they do this, they now have an ownership feeling, and they actually invest into ensuring, because the problems we have is that people do not want to pay. And sometimes we still believe in Africa that electricity is a social good. No, it's not. So these people help in ensuring that it's not. They make sure that the use of the energy is productive use of energy. It's not to watch television. When they have this power, you find out saloons spring up. welders come into place, people that have milling machines. Actual use of energy that brings them income comes in, and that way they're now able to buy more power, able to take care of anything that comes up in the community. So it's a model that has started right now. It's been used in Uganda, it's been used in Liberia, and guess what? We brought it to Nigeria, and we're starting off with Lagos State.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yes, because Lagos State is densely populated. You have a lot of SMEs going on there. So people are actually able to use the power and probably pay for it rather than going to throw it into some village and forest that they might not be able to use it well enough. So working with the Lagos State government, they've given extreme good support to have this going, and we would like to replicate this activity to other states by the time we finish rolling out with Lagos State. It's clean energy, by the way, as well, because you're using green mini grids. You can use the existing grid, but you now have to have that reliability of power to the cooperative to make sure that they're invested and ready to pay for the supply of power. It's a very interesting model, but it's a model that I think will take off very well in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. It's been amazing having you on the podcast. Thank you for your contribution. And it's so nice to see a woman in this position leading partnerships across Africa.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Thanks for listening.